In the autumn of AD 1097, the Crusaders arrived at the gates of Antioch. After months of marching across Asia Minor, Jerusalem, their ultimate goal, seemed almost within reach. But before they could continue south, they had to capture one of the strongest and most heavily fortified cities of the medieval world, Antioch. What they expected to be another victory soon became a nightmare. Behind Antioch's towering walls stood a determined Turkish garrison. Beyond the city, rival Muslim rulers prepared their armies. As the weeks passed, food disappeared, disease spread through the camps, morale crumbled, and every day became a fight for survival. More than once, the First Crusade came dangerously close to ending in total disaster. In this first episode, we will examine how the Siege of Antioch began, why the city was so difficult to capture, and how the first months of the campaign descended into hunger, hardship, and desperate fighting. These opening events laid the foundation for one of the greatest sieges of the Middle Ages. In the next episode, we will follow the arrival of Muslim relief armies and the decisive Battle of Lake Antioch. In the final episode, we will witness the dramatic fall of Antioch and the extraordinary events that secured one of the most remarkable victories of the First Crusade. This is the story of the beginning of the Siege of Antioch, a siege that would test the endurance, leadership, and faith of everyone involved. By the late summer of AD 1097, the crusading army had reached northern Syria, arriving at the frontier of the Holy Land. Although Jerusalem, their ultimate objective, was now within relatively close reach, likely only about a month's march to the south, one formidable challenge remained. The great city of Antioch, one of the most important urban and military centers of the eastern Mediterranean, blocked the road to Palestine. To continue their advance, the Crusaders were forced to besiege Antioch, beginning what became one of the longest, harshest, and most demanding military campaigns of the medieval period. The siege lasted for nearly 18 months, bringing the entire expedition to a standstill in northern Syria. More than at any other stage of the First Crusade, the outcome of the campaign hung in the balance, as the Crusaders faced the constant threat of starvation, defeat, and complete destruction. It was during this prolonged struggle that the very idea of crusading was put to its greatest test. Located on the banks of the Orontes River, about 12 miles from the Mediterranean Sea, Antioch was founded around 300 BC by Seleucus I, the founder of the Seleucid Empire, who named the city after his father, Antiochus. Thanks to its strategic position and access to major trade routes, Antioch quickly grew into one of the most influential cities of the ancient world. During the Roman Empire, it ranked as the empire's third largest city after Rome and Alexandria and became a major center of administration, commerce, and culture. Antioch was equally significant in the history of Christianity. According to the New Testament, it was here that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. The city also became the seat of St. Peter's first bishopric, giving it a place of lasting importance in the development of the early church. The city's prosperity declined during the 6th century AD, when a series of powerful earthquakes and the Persian capture and sack of Antioch caused widespread destruction. Its fortunes fell further after the Arab conquest, as political power and commercial activity increasingly shifted to the inland city of Aleppo. Nevertheless, Antioch experienced a revival after the Byzantine Empire recaptured it in the 10th century. It once again became a major commercial hub where Byzantine and Muslim merchants exchanged goods, while its massive fortifications made it one of the strongest defensive positions on the empire's Syrian frontier. After Antioch came under Turkish control, the Seljuks of northern Syria briefly established political unity across much of the region. This cohesion was largely the achievement of Malik Shah, whose military strength and political skill enabled him to bring Baghdad and the surrounding territories under his authority. However, his death in AD 1092 triggered a succession crisis that quickly shattered this unity, dividing the Seljuk Empire into competing regional powers. By the time the First Crusade reached Syria in AD 1097, the political landscape had become deeply fragmented. Malik Shah's son was engaged in a struggle to secure control of Baghdad, while his nephews, Ridwan of Aleppo and Duqaq of Damascus, competed for dominance in Syria and sought influence over Antioch. The city itself was ruled by the experienced Turkoman governor Yaghi Siyan, an ambitious leader who carefully balanced his alliances between Aleppo and Damascus in an effort to preserve his own independence. Rather than fully aligning with either ruler, he shifted his loyalties whenever it served his political interests. The Seljuks also faced internal divisions along religious lines. Although the Turkish ruling elite largely adhered to Sunni Islam, significant Shiite Arab communities remained scattered throughout northern Syria. These political rivalries and sectarian divisions prevented the emergence of a united Muslim response to the approaching Crusaders. As a result, Antioch's Turkish garrison found itself relatively isolated, unable to rely on immediate or coordinated military support from the surrounding Seljuk rulers. Faced with this unstable political situation, Yaghi Siyan viewed the approach of the large Western European crusading army with growing concern. The Crusaders were an unfamiliar and unpredictable force, and although Antioch was defended by a strong, well-supplied garrison, he recognized that the city might not be able to withstand a prolonged siege without outside assistance. To strengthen Antioch's defenses, Yaghi Siyan dispatched his two sons, Shams ad-Dawla and Muhammad, on diplomatic missions to seek military support from the rulers of Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul in Mesopotamia. At the same time, fearing that the city's Christian population might sympathize with the advancing Crusaders or assist them from within, he ordered the expulsion of many Christians living inside Antioch's walls as a precautionary security measure. Yaghi Siyan's appeals for help received mixed responses. Ridwan of Aleppo refused to provide assistance, likely because of earlier political conflicts with Antioch's governor. In contrast, Duqaq of Damascus responded positively after Yaghi Siyan's son, Shams ad-Dawla, personally requested aid. Duqaq organized a relief force supported by his Atabeg, Tatakin, and Jana ad-Dawla, the ruler of Homs. At the same time, another envoy sought assistance from Kurboga, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul. Recognizing that the Crusaders posed a serious threat to the Muslim states of the region, Kurboga assembled a large army to relieve Antioch. He was also motivated by his own political ambitions, as gaining control of Antioch would strengthen his influence over northern Syria. Meanwhile, Yaghi Siyan reinforced the city's defenses, gathered his forces, and stockpiled supplies in preparation for a long siege. Antioch was among the most formidable fortified cities of the medieval world, and many contemporaries believed it could not be captured by a direct assault. Its immense stone walls, constructed with exceptionally strong masonry, were considered virtually impossible to break. The walls were reinforced by hundreds of towers. Crusader sources claimed between 360 and 450, though the true number was probably lower. Even so, these accounts illustrate the overwhelming impression the city's defenses made on Western Europeans. The city's natural landscape greatly enhanced its fortifications. The Orontes River ran alongside the western walls, limiting the movement of attacking forces. To the north, the walls rose from marshy ground, while to the east and west they climbed steep mountain slopes. The southern defenses followed the crest of a narrow ridge, crossed a deep ravine through the Iron Gate, and ended at a massive citadel that towered nearly 1,000 feet above the city. The closely spaced towers ensured that every section of the walls remained within range of defending archers, making any assault extremely costly. Access to Antioch was controlled by several heavily fortified gates. The Gate of St. Paul opened onto the road to Aleppo, while the Gate of St. George connected the city with Latakia and the Mediterranean coast. A fortified bridge over the Orontes guarded the route to Alexandretta and the port of St. Simeon, while the smaller Gate of the Duke and Gate of the Dog provided additional access to the river. Antioch was also well equipped to survive a lengthy siege. The city contained abundant freshwater supplies, gardens, pasture land, and enough space to shelter and provision a large army. It was defended by a Turkish garrison of around 5,000 soldiers and held substantial food reserves. Moreover, the rugged mountains south of the city were too steep for an army to occupy, making it impossible for the Crusaders to encircle Antioch completely and cut off all communication or supplies. For these reasons, many contemporaries believed that Antioch could resist any army as long as its food lasted. Its immense size, strong fortifications, and secure internal resources made a successful blockade extremely difficult. Although these defenses caused immense hardship for the Crusaders during the siege, they also inspired admiration. Even hostile observers described Antioch as a magnificent and remarkably beautiful city, whose strength matched its grandeur. As the crusading army advanced into Yaghi Siyan's territory, it first reached the town of Marada, whose Turkish garrison abandoned the settlement without offering resistance. From there, Robert of Flanders led a detachment southwest to the town of Arta, where the local Christian population had already overthrown and killed the Turkish garrison. On the 20th of October 1097, the main crusading force arrived at the Iron Bridge, a strategically important crossing over the Orontes River where the roads from Marash and Aleppo converged. The bridge was protected by 2 fortified towers, but the Crusaders launched an immediate assault under the leadership of Bishop Adhémar of Le Puy. After fierce fighting, they captured the crossing, securing a major strategic victory. They also seized a large convoy of cattle, sheep, and grain that had been intended to resupply Yaghi Siyan's forces inside Antioch. Medieval accounts, however, differ on how the battle at the Iron Bridge unfolded. French chroniclers describe it as a swift victory, claiming that the Turkish defenders panicked and fled as soon as the Crusaders attacked. In contrast, Lotharingian sources portray the engagement as a prolonged and hard-fought battle. According to their version, the Crusaders held their ground only after Bishop Adhémar inspired the army with a stirring address, urging them to stand firm and assuring them that God was fighting alongside them. Regardless of these differing accounts, the capture of the Iron Bridge proved to be a decisive success, allowing the Crusaders to begin the long and difficult Siege of Antioch. With the Iron Bridge under their control, the road to Antioch lay open. The Crusaders soon caught sight of the city's towering fortifications, and on the following day, Bohemond, leading the vanguard, reached the walls, with the rest of the army arriving shortly afterward. Confident after their recent success, many Crusaders believed that Antioch would fall quickly. On 21 October AD 1097, the Crusaders formally began the Siege of Antioch. Unlike the earlier Siege of Nicaea, however, they were unable to surround the city completely because of its formidable natural and man-made defenses. The Orontes River, steep mountains, and rugged southern terrain prevented a full blockade, leaving parts of Antioch beyond the Crusaders' control. Instead, the Crusaders concentrated their forces along the city's northwestern sector, establishing camps beside the Orontes River to monitor the most accessible sections of the walls. At the same time, they sent out foraging parties to secure food and other supplies from the surrounding countryside. During the opening weeks of the siege, these efforts were successful, as the region still provided enough resources to sustain the army while preparations for what would become a prolonged siege continued. The army was organized largely by regional groups. Bohemond and most of the southern Italian Normans camped opposite the Gate of St. Paul, with Tancred's forces positioned behind them. The northern French, led by Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Hugh of Vermandois, and Stephen of Blois, occupied the next section of the line. Raymond of Toulouse, together with Bishop Adhémar of Le Puy and the southern French forces, blockaded the Dog Gate, while Godfrey of Bouillon camped near what became known as the Gate of the Duke. The Byzantine contingent under Tatikios remained farther from the walls, likely serving as a reserve force. These positions were influenced not only by military considerations, but also by political ambition. According to the medieval principle of right by conquest, those who first gained control of a strategic location could claim valuable rewards after a city's capture. Since controlling a major gate could provide the first opportunity to enter Antioch, commanders were already thinking about the division of loot, territory, and political authority. Bohemond's decision to occupy the important Gate of St. Paul reflected these ambitions, suggesting that some Crusader leaders had begun planning for Antioch's future long before the city itself was conquered. During the first 2 weeks of the siege, the defenders of Antioch remained behind their walls, choosing not to confront the Crusaders directly, Instead, they observed the Crusaders' movements while waiting for relief forces from other Muslim rulers. This allowed the Crusaders to establish their camps and organize the siege with little interference. For the Crusaders, these early days were marked by relative security and an ample supply of food from the surrounding countryside. However, not everyone viewed this period positively. The Crusader chaplain Raymond of Toulouse argued that the army's comfort led to complacency. Discipline declined, guards were often neglected, and the camps became vulnerable to a surprise attack. He also believed that this peaceful period encouraged selfishness among the Crusaders, as many focused on personal gain rather than the success of the expedition as a whole. In his view, this lack of unity threatened the effectiveness of the crusading army even before the real hardships of the siege had begun. Once the Turkish defenders realized that the Crusaders could not launch an immediate assault, they adopted a strategy of constant harassment rather than open battle. Instead of remaining entirely behind Antioch's walls, small groups of soldiers carried out frequent raids and ambushes against the Crusaders whenever opportunities arose. One of the main threats came from the Iron Gate, which gave the defenders access to Mount Storin. From this elevated position, Turkish archers fired arrows into Bohemond's camp, causing casualties even without engaging in direct combat. The defenders also used the unblocked bridge gate to cross the Orontes River and launch hit-and-run attacks against the Crusader camps. Their mounted archers, lightly equipped and highly mobile, could fire arrows from a distance before quickly retreating behind the city's defenses. Raymond of Toulouse and Bishop Adhémar, whose forces camped closest to the river, suffered the most from these raids, losing many of their horses to the Turkish archers. The Crusaders also faced attacks from Harim, a nearby Muslim-held fortress about 15 kilometers east of Antioch. Overlooking the road to the Iron Bridge, Harim allowed Turkish forces to ambush isolated Crusaders and threaten the army's supply routes. As food supplies from the surrounding countryside began to decline by mid-November, these raids became an increasingly serious problem. To improve their position, the Crusaders sought to limit the defenders' freedom of movement and secure their own communications. One of their first measures was the construction of a temporary bridge across the Orontes River opposite the Gate of the Duke. Built by tying together small boats with ropes, this floating bridge made movement between the two riverbanks easier than relying on a single ferry. However, it remained difficult for heavily armed knights to cross quickly. During one skirmish, the knight Henry of Esch grew impatient with the delay and attempted to swim across the river on horseback. Burdened by his armor, he was nearly swept under the deep waters, but he managed to reach the opposite bank safely, an event that contemporaries regarded as a sign of divine protection. According to the chroniclers Albert of Aachen and William of Tyre, the defenders of Antioch also used the smaller Dog Bridge to launch raids against the southern French forces led by Raymond of Toulouse and Bishop Adhémar. In response, the Crusaders attempted to disable the bridge, leading to one of the few assaults during the siege that employed siege machinery. The Crusaders first tried to demolish the bridge with hammers and picks, but heavy missile fire from the defenders and the bridge's strong stone construction made this impossible. They then built a mobile armored shelter, known as a mole or talpa, to protect workers as they approached the bridge. However, a sortie by the Turkish garrison forced the defenders of the machine to retreat, and the structure was set on fire and destroyed. The Crusaders next deployed 3 artillery engines against the nearby gate and curtain wall to keep the defenders occupied. Although the bombardment provided covering fire, it failed to damage Antioch's fortifications. Unable to destroy the bridge, the Crusaders finally blocked it by piling up timber, stones, earth, and other materials, making it much more difficult for the defenders to use it for further raids. On 17 November, AD 1097, 13 Genoese ships arrived at the port of St. Simeon, carrying soldiers, craftsmen, and much-needed supplies for the Crusaders. Their timely arrival suggests that at least some logistical support for the expedition had been planned before the Crusaders left Europe. Recognizing the importance of these reinforcements, the Crusader leaders decided to use the newly arrived manpower and materials to strengthen the siege. They constructed a small fort on the slopes of Mount Stauren near the Gate of St. Paul, known as Malregard. This fort helped secure the northern section of the blockade and protected the Crusader camps from the frequent raids launched by the defenders of Antioch. As autumn gave way to winter, the Crusaders' optimism began to fade. Food supplies were beginning to decline, morale weakened, and frequent Turkish raids made it ever more dangerous to gather provisions. One of the greatest threats came from the Muslim-held fortress of Harim, whose garrison regularly ambushed Crusaders traveling between the army and nearby supply areas. These attacks disrupted the vital task of foraging and forced the Crusader leaders to take action. On 18 November, AD 1097, one day after the arrival of the Genoese supply fleet, Bohemond was sent east with Robert of Flanders and around 150 knights to deal with the Harim garrison. After locating the fortress, Bohemond employed a classic battlefield tactic used by both the Normans and the Turks. A small group of Crusaders advanced to provoke the defenders before deliberately retreating, luring the Turkish force into pursuit. Although 2 Crusaders were killed during the withdrawal, the plan succeeded. The pursuing Turks rode directly into an ambush prepared by Bohemond's main force. Bohemond then led a decisive counterattack, killing many of the defenders and capturing the survivors. This victory reduced the immediate threat from Harim and temporarily made the Crusaders' supply routes safer. Following the victory at Harim, Bohemond took a harsh step intended to intimidate the defenders of Antioch. He ordered the execution of the captured Turkish prisoners outside the city gates, and according to later accounts, their severed heads were even hurled into the city using siege engines. This marked one of the earliest examples during the siege of the Crusaders, deliberately using terror as a psychological weapon against their enemies. The defenders responded with similar brutality. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch was publicly tortured on the city walls to demonstrate that the Muslims remained in control, while captured Crusaders were often executed. In one incident, Adalbaro, the Archdeacon of Metz, was captured outside the city, beheaded, and his companion was abused and killed. The following day, their severed heads were launched into the Crusader camp as a warning. Although these actions appear exceptionally brutal today, such acts of violence and psychological intimidation were common features of medieval warfare and became a recurring aspect of the Siege of Antioch. By the end of November, AD 1097, the Crusaders faced a far greater enemy than the defenders of Antioch: hunger. The food supplies they had gathered when the siege began were rapidly exhausted, and shortages soon spread throughout the army. Although the Armenian rulers of Cilicia and the monks of the Black Mountains sent provisions to assist the Crusaders, these efforts were not enough to meet the army's growing needs. As supplies dwindled, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Disease and starvation claimed many lives, with some contemporary sources claiming that as many as 1 in 5 Crusaders died. By mid-December, the situation had become so severe that the Crusader leaders met to discuss how they could obtain enough food to keep the army alive. The worsening conditions also affected morale. Some Crusaders, including senior nobles, temporarily left the siege in search of better conditions or additional supplies. Robert of Normandy traveled to the Byzantine-held city of Latakia, while others abandoned the campaign altogether. Those who remained, including Godfrey of Bouillon, endured increasing hardship, with Godfrey himself falling seriously ill as the siege entered one of its most difficult phases. By Christmas, AD 1097, the Crusaders had nearly exhausted their remaining food supplies, and the surrounding countryside could no longer provide enough provisions to sustain the army. In response, the Crusader leaders held a council and decided to send a large foraging expedition under Bohemond and Robert of Flanders up the Orontes Valley toward Hama. Their mission was to gather as much food and livestock as possible from the villages in the region. While Bohemond's force was away, Raymond of Toulouse and Bishop Adhémar of Le Puy were left in command of the siege. On 28 December AD 1097, Bohemond and Robert of Flanders departed with a large force, reportedly around 20,000 men, to gather food and supplies in the Orontes Valley. Their absence was quickly noticed by Yaghi Siyan, who seized the opportunity to strike the weakened Crusader army. During the night of 29 December AD 1097, the Turkish garrison launched a major sortie across the bridge and attacked the Crusader camps north of the Orontes River, where Raymond of Toulouse's forces were likely stationed. Although the assault caught the Crusaders by surprise, Raymond reacted swiftly, assembling a force of knights and counterattacking. The defenders were driven back toward the bridge, and the Crusaders briefly gained a foothold on the opposite side before the city gates were closed. For a moment, it appeared that Antioch itself might be captured by assault. However, the attack soon descended into confusion. According to Raymond of Aguilers, a Provençal knight was thrown from his horse while attempting to outflank the defenders. As the riderless horse ran away, several knights chased after it to recover the valuable warhorse. The infantry, lacking clear leadership and unable to understand what had happened, mistook the movement for a retreat and fled in panic. The resulting disorder turned a promising assault into a costly failure. Although casualties were relatively limited, around 15 knights and 20 infantrymen, according to one contemporary source, the psychological impact was severe. Raymond of Aguilers described the defeat as a humiliating setback and interpreted it as divine punishment for the army's moral failings and growing desire for wealth rather than spiritual devotion. The failed assault damaged morale, disrupted leadership, and deepened the sense of crisis within the Crusader camp. Raymond of Toulouse soon fell ill once again, and for many Crusaders, the prospect of failure and the collapse of the entire expedition appeared increasingly likely. Meanwhile, the Crusaders' foraging expedition likely traveled south of Antioch before turning east through the Rouge Valley and onto the fertile Jabal as-Sumak plateau. The region provided abundant food, and for several days, Bohemond's and Robert of Flanders' forces gathered as many supplies as they could carry. By the night of 30 to 31 December AD 1097, while camped near the town of Albara, they believed their mission had been successfully completed. However, the expedition had made a serious mistake. Whether because of poor coordination or simple oversight, Bohemond and Robert failed to deploy scouts to monitor the surrounding area. As a result, they were unaware that a Muslim relief army from Damascus was approaching only a few kilometers away. The army had been assembled by Duqaq of Damascus in response to repeated appeals from Yaghi Siyan's son, Shams ad-Dawla. Accompanied by his Atabeg Tuqtigin and the Emir of Homs, Duqaq marched toward Antioch in mid-December to relieve the city. Although contemporary Crusader sources greatly exaggerated its strength, claiming around 60,000 men, the force probably numbered no more than 10,000 soldiers. Even so, it was a powerful army, and if it had reached Antioch without opposition, it could have posed a serious threat to the Crusaders and potentially changed the course of the siege. By chance, the Crusaders' foraging force and Duqaq's relief army met before either reached Antioch. Early on 31 December AD 1097, while the Crusaders were likely still camped near Albara, Duqaq's army appeared and attempted to surround them. The unexpected encounter placed Bohemond's and Robert of Flanders' force in grave danger. Despite the surprise, the Crusader commanders reacted quickly. Robert of Flanders led a frontal cavalry attack against the advancing Muslim troops, while Bohemond kept part of his force in reserve to prevent Duqaq from completing the encirclement. In the fierce fighting that followed, the Crusader cavalry succeeded in breaking through the enemy lines, forcing many of Duqaq's soldiers to withdraw. Rather than continue the battle, Bohemond and Robert chose to retreat while they still had the opportunity. Their cavalry escaped, but the slower infantry and nearly all the food collected during the expedition were left behind, resulting in heavy losses through death or capture. Militarily, the battle ended without a decisive victor. Both sides suffered casualties, and neither destroyed the other. However, Duqaq abandoned his march to Antioch and returned to Damascus, ending the immediate threat to the siege. Even so, the expedition was a major setback for the Crusaders. Most of their infantry had been lost, the valuable supplies they had gathered were abandoned, and the army at Antioch remained desperately short of food. Although Robert of Flanders later recovered a small amount of provisions by attacking isolated enemy stragglers, it was far from enough to relieve the growing famine. Contemporary chroniclers tried to portray the outcome positively or ignored it altogether, but it was clear that the Crusaders had been caught by surprise and had narrowly avoided disaster. The Crusaders' failed foraging expedition was soon followed by a series of events that many interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. The day after their retreat, a powerful earthquake shook the region. That evening, the northern sky glowed with an unusual red light, and in the weeks that followed, relentless rain and bitter cold made life in the Crusader camp even more miserable. Many believed these hardships reflected God's anger at the army's growing pride, indiscipline, and plundering. In response, Bishop Adhémar of Le Puy ordered a 3-day fast, but with famine already spreading through the camp, the measure offered little relief. As the new year of AD 1098 began, the Crusaders had survived 2 major crises, but their situation was growing increasingly desperate. Hunger, disease, exhaustion, and constant fighting had pushed the army to the brink of collapse. Inside Antioch, the defenders also faced mounting pressure, yet they remained in a stronger position thanks to their access to supplies and nearby allies. Neither side had gained a decisive advantage, and the siege had become a brutal test of endurance. The struggle for Antioch was far from over. In the months ahead, the Crusaders would face fresh Muslim relief armies, worsening famine, internal divisions, and some of the fiercest fighting of the entire First Crusade. We will conclude this episode here. In the next episode, we will explore the next phase of the Siege of Antioch, including the Battle of Lake Antioch and the desperate struggle for survival that followed.